Morning. Thank you all for coming and thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor, obviously, to be the day 2 keynote. I don't know about you guys, but I haven't been out for a while, so this is like my second outing since lockdown. I guess there's quite a lot of that. Anyone else here new to the scene or renew to the scene? Yeah, most of us. So it's kind of weird, but we'll get through it. So today I'm going to be talking about, I'll get to the agenda in a second, sorry. So I've been introduced, but I'll say again, the usual disclaimers. Although I work for IBM and I am the lead hardware hacker for X-Force Red, this is my own talk. It's not an IBM sort of sanctioned talk, so my opinions are my own. This is my own kind of ramblings. And yeah, Jeff has already covered the other bits. I am quartermaster at DEF CON. If you ever need a projector or a Sharpie or something, you come and talk to me. Sharpie is the most important tool, by the way. So my test of if you're really a hacker is, I want to see what's in your pocket. And if one of those things is a Sharpie, then you must be a hacker, because that's the thing I get asked for most at DEF CON. So clearly it's a really important hacking tool. Okay, so quick agenda. What are we talking about here? Time and synchronization, and something that I was a bit surprised with, when I started looking at this stuff, just how kind of fragile the ecosystem is. And time is something we really take hugely for granted. And so I kind of assumed as an outsider, and again, I'll stress this is not, I'm not a time synchronization expert. I'm looking at this from the point of view of a sort of hacker, an outside user of these services. And so from that viewpoint, it just seemed a bit surprising. And so I wanted to bring that conversation more to the fore and amongst my peers, people that I talk to about low-level, deeply technical, sort of deep stuff. This is not something I've heard talked about at normal hacker conferences. So I did want to just sort of bring it a bit to the fore. As I mentioned, it's not super technical, it's a keynote, so I'm just kind of talking about, or rambling possibly, about my musings on the subject. But being a techie, I couldn't resist throwing in a demo. So you'll notice there's a couple of clocks here that will become apparent as we go on. So why time? You talked about, briefly I talked in the introduction about lockdown and this is my first time out. Probably like a lot of you, things changed a bit during lockdown and we sort of looked for things to keep us sane and interested, and rather than turning to my normal sort of security stuff, for some reason, I don't know why, I got drawn towards clocks and horology, and in particular, electromagnetic clocks. So my family think I've completely lost the plot. Even my Labradors are looking at me strangely, because the house is now full of clocks. I've got like 20 clocks in my office and piles of them waiting to be torn apart and examined and repaired and reconstituted. So yeah, it's slightly strange. I don't know where that came from. It came completely from left field, but I got deeply into it. And being a geek and a techie, like probably most of us in the audience, once you get your teeth into a subject, you want to know everything about it, and you dive deeper and deeper. So I already mentioned I work for IBM, and something that surprised me there as well is people don't realize the history of IBM, and that actually, as it happens, IBM roots are in time and timekeeping. So the original IBM was the International Time Recording Company, and they basically made equipment for clocking in and out. That has gone through various evolutions of then marrying that technology with other technologies like the Computing Scale Company, which basically made equipment that would convert like weighing scales into an actual value. So when you ordered when you went into a grocer's and bought a product, it tabulated and converted the weight into a value for the shopkeeper, and so on. So various sort of iterations of that became more and more complex, the kind of things they were doing with time and automation processes, and it ended up becoming International Business Machines, or IBM for short. So that's who I now work for. And again, by pure coincidence, as it happens, I grew up in West London in an area called Chiswick. And just down the road, there were a few IBM buildings in the area, but just down the road there was a big factory in Beaver Lane where they made clocks. And this particular clock is one of my favorites in my collection. It's actually what's known as a master clock. And basically, it's a very accurate timekeeper, which then drives other clocks through electrical impulses. So it looks like a sort of classic pendulum clock, but actually behind that face, there's a whole load of gubbins and electronics and electrics. It's actually wired directly to the mains. And the mains keeps the pendulum swinging, but it also then sends these impulses every 30 seconds to slave faces. So I just thought it was kind of funny that I've come full circle from growing up next door to the factory that made a clock that's now sitting in my house, and I work for the company that made it. So just a bit of background there. So deeper thinkers than I have been thinking about time for a long time. Isaac Newton was considered that time was absolute, that we could only perceive time based on observation. So time was a sort of immutable, running along. We couldn't affect it. It couldn't be affected by anything. We could only observe it through movement of planets or apples falling on our heads or whatever. Einstein, on the other hand, argued fairly convincingly that time is relative, and actually it can be different for different observers depending on how fast they're going, gravity effects and stuff like that. And then there's also the third view. So we don't have to figure out who was right. I think the jury's still out on that one. But it is fairly clear that time and time synchronization has been important to society and to us for hundreds of years. So, from the very early sort of Chinese water towers that had big gongs and bells and things that actually signaled to the population what the time was on a regular basis, to just down the road, as it happens, so about 2 miles down the road is Greenwich, and the clock on the bottom left there is the Shepherd's Gate clock, which was the first slave clock face that was shown to the public to actually tell them what Greenwich Mean Time was. And Greenwich Mean Time was invented, it was the first proper official synchronization of time. So before Greenwich Mean Time came along, you had local time. And usually in countries like England, you would set your clock from the railway station clock. So that would be the accurate local time, and that was set probably from a sundial, believe it or not. But because of the difference in longitude, there would be a half-hour difference between the east and the west in England, and obviously in bigger countries like America, that's a much bigger problem. So the need to synchronize clocks, came around, and GMT was settled on as I say, the first proper official point in time. And this clock, as I say, that was the slave that was on the edge of the observatory, and the public could view it. But it also ended up then being connected to a network of clocks, over 100 clocks around the country, so that nationally we had synchronized time going from there. There's also these funny little balls that there's one on the top of the building, and the US Navy, I believe, had a similar thing. And at 1 p.m. every day, the ball would drop, so it's exactly 1 o'clock. If you're interested in the history of time and civilization, there's actually a really good book by a guy called David Rooney called About Time, and it talks about the development of clocks and how they were used geopolitically, which is really interesting. Okay, so moving on to modern times, why do we care about time and synchronization? Well, as Martin Fago said, everything now depends on time and synchronization. So from communications to navigation and so on. So having a resilient source of accurate time is incredibly important. And when you try and sort of get specific about what synchronized time is used for, pretty much everything you look at. So, when I started to put a sort of list together, it was just ridiculously long. So, things like logging of transactions. If you're buying and selling shares, who actually made the transaction first on a distributed system? For forensics, when did something happen? If you're looking back at historical records of events on a network, you need to have accurate time to log them. The low-level technical details of how protocols work, if you've got multiplexing and communication protocols like Bluetooth or whatever, they all depend on accurate timing for packets to come and go and not bump into each other. Very simple stuff like crypto, anti-replay, time stamping packets, cryptocurrency and blockchain proof of work. You have to have an accurate pool of clocks such that one, say, Bitcoin is produced every 10 minutes globally. And that pool of clocks needs to be, and the ledgers involved need to be obviously synchronized or the whole thing falls apart. So you can go on and on. Everything pretty much depends on it. And of course, industry and government are becoming concerned about these things. So, we provide resources for big companies and banks and government to synchronize their time. And so in the UK, there was this report in 2017 that looked at the cost of that network failing, of the time synchronization failing. And it was £1 billion a day. I mean, that's huge. We think the pandemic was bad, but if that happened, that's like really huge. So obviously, people are worried. And one of the things that came to light when people start thinking about, well, what is the resilience problem with time syncing currently, is basically it all seems to fall back to GPS. So GPS, once the military switched off the sort of deliberate skewing of the clocks and so on, and it became a reliable network that was freely available to everyone, it got adopted by everyone. So not surprisingly, you have an accurate, cheap resource, very easy to tap into, very cheap electronics required to be able to synchronize to GPS. So not surprisingly, it's become the sort of de facto standard for everything. And because of that, as it says in this report, it creates a sort of existential threat to the whole ecosystem, because we just, everyone comes back to that same point. And this is from a report from the Resilient Navigation Timing Foundation. And what's interesting, when I started digging in all this stuff, what was really quite interesting is a lot of these reports are very recent. I mean, things like, adding reliable crypto to the NTP protocol. That RFC was only ratified in 2020. And this report is from 2020. And again, a lot of the papers, whether it be from the UK or from the US or other places in the world that I've read while studying for this talk, it's all only in the last couple of years that people are sort of waking up and going, well, hang on a minute, we might have a problem here. So that was quite interesting to me. So one of the recommendations is that you diversify your sources. So again, this is a government US agency report saying, it's quite detailed, and it talks about test plans, and it talks about what you need to be aware of as a user and a provider of secure time or accurate time. And this is one of the main messages is, don't have a single source of failure. Have multiple sources. But the problem with that solution is when you actually dig down into the kind of alternatives that are being proposed for alternative sources, like telco networks, if you actually get down to the nuts and bolts and look under the hood, what they're doing, underneath those networks themselves, they just synchronize back to GPS. So you've gone full circle. So obviously, that's an issue. And again, that's from the same source. So let's look at how time is currently distributed. So NTP and PTP are network protocols for distributing time. And they are not themselves the source of time, obviously. They need an external resource that tells them what is the current time. And the main source is usually an atomic clock. So you have this sort of stratum of clocks which are from the most reliable at the top and the most trusted at the top down to, I think it's like stratum 15 or so, which is a daisy chain of clocks that you may connect to. So stratum 0 are the ones that are run by national organizations like NIST or NPL in the UK, and they have their own atomic clocks and so on. And stratum 1 may have direct connections to atomic clocks, but they will go also via the stratum 0 clocks. So those are the ones that we generally connect to. So we will connect to a stratum 1 clock over the internet using NTP or PTP. But the sources of time, so we've already talked about GPS being a potential single point of failure and something that everyone is using. So what are the other options? Well, you've got mobile phone systems. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. I will actually, look at some specific issues with mobile phone systems. But the other main source is these low-frequency radio broadcasts. And that was the thing that I decided to sort of dig a bit deeper into and look at and how that works. So basically what you have is the local provider will have a very powerful transmitter that transmits on low frequency. So in the US, it's in Colorado. In the UK, here it's up in Cumbria. It used to be called the Rugby clock, but now it's moved to Cumbria some years ago, and it's broadcast from there. And in the UK, it's called MSF. And again, the stratum 1 clocks could rely on that as well. So as I mentioned, I do have a demo. You may have noticed, the observant amongst you, that there are 2 clocks on the front of the stage. This guy, the white one, is, I hope, synchronized. Is it showing the right time? Yep. So this guy is synchronized to the National Physical Laboratory atomic clock via NTP. So it's talking to my local time server, which is then running on a Raspberry Pi, which is synchronized to the NPL master clocks. This one is what's called a radio-controlled clock, and that is receiving the MSF signal. So as one of the audio guys who was helping me get this set up said, oh, like the thing on my parents' wall in their kitchen. So very cheap, very common, very accurate in theory. So what it does is every, 10 minutes or so, it checks the signal and adjusts itself. Now, I was curious if I could spoof that signal. And it didn't take long to find that actually I'm not the first person who's needed to do this. People have actually written software when they've moved house. So they've gone from living in America to living in the UK, and their radio clock or their radio watch no longer synchronizes because the time signals are not standardized. So rather than sell their clock and buy a new one, they've got out their coding skills, and they've created a package to actually deliver these time signals. So I came across this thing called TX Tempus, and it has the added benefit that it's using inductance rather than an actual RF transmission. So this wire you can see here is, again, coming from my Raspberry Pi, and it's attached to that antenna, which is wrapped around the normal mechanism is on the right. And I've just put a little RF, or not RF, it's actually an RFID antenna that I had lying around. You don't even have to be that careful about tuning it because it's so close proximity, it'll just work. So I'm going to set this going because it's slightly indeterminate exactly when it's going to kick in, but I'm going to try and override the signal that it received this morning and synchronize to, and I'm going to send my own signal to produce an obviously incorrect time on that clock. So I just need to come out of here. So chat amongst yourselves for a second while I do this. Okay, so I've set my spoof running. So as I say, I don't know when exactly it's going to kick in, but what I'm doing is sending sort of inverted time. So basically, whatever the real time is, whatever shape that the hands are making, you should see the exact opposite. So it should be obviously wrong. But we'll come back to the detail on that in a bit. So, getting back to the industry advice and the industry concerns. So this is a slide from the NPL, National Physical Laboratory, who provide the atomic master clock signal. And their advice is, stick a fiber in, have a direct connection back to us. And the reasons they give is, they could be sunspots getting in the way, they could be jamming, interference, building effects, whatever. So there's a lot of things that can interfere with your signal, including deliberate attack. So if you want to have a reliable time source from their atomic clock, best way to do it is fiber. But obviously that's a costly solution. What if you are not a government or a bank or a financial institution or a telco? How do you get an alternative source of accurate time other than GPS? So we've got GPS, we've got GSM. Again, I'll talk about some issues with that. You've got your local telco. You've got various other broadcasts like DVB, so digital video, which has replaced our sort of analog TV. So DVB-T, terrestrial, S, satellite, or C, cable. And then you've got the RF signals that I just talked about, so the various different countries and their broadcasts, so MSF, WWVB in the US, JJY in Japan, and DCF 77 in Europe, broadcast from Germany. And actually, if you're interested, there's quite a number of these things, and the full list is on this Wikipedia link. And then it may be that you can extract time from a sub-channel of something like RDS or DAB, because all of those services do have a time signal in them, so that your car clock can set itself, or your radio clock can, your radio receiver at home can have a secondary clock function. But when I looked at this in detail, I actually did find some discrepancies. So these are a few that I had lying around at home. So on the left, the top left clock is a GPS receiver. So this is a very cheap sort of add-on head-up display for your vehicle. If you want to be able to check how accurate your speedometer is, it's about 15 quid on Amazon, and that shows you the current time according to local satellites. And on this one, it's showing 15:02, whereas my telco, which is the landline telco, not the 3G or 4G, is showing a minute later. So we've got already a discrepancy there. Which one is right? Probably GPS in this case. The second, the one in the middle, is an NTP clock running on my mobile phone, which has a nice little feature that it also shows you the difference of the telco network time to the NTP time. And as you can see on this one, they're running almost 5 seconds different from each other. And part of the reason for that is there's a lot of indeterminate processes within GSM that will cause signal differences and timing differences. So at the very low level, the network itself requires accurate timing to run, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can deliver an accurate time signal to you as the end user over your GSM device. So you can be a few seconds out. And similarly, the one on the right is the local telco, which is showing 15:05, but it's a bit hard to tell from the angle of the clock, but that's actually showing 15:04 and a half. So we're 30 seconds out from NTP with the local telco, which is quite a chunk of change if you're talking about accurate timing. 30 seconds is not accurate by any stretch of the imagination. And then I did observe some interesting failure modes. So just a couple of weeks ago, the clocks went back for an hour. And here are my 3 favorite radio clocks and NTP clocks. So you can see the guy on the left, this one automatically adjusted. I got up in the morning and it was showing the correct time. So did this one. It got the radio signal and it adjusted. The other one, which is actually from the 80s, so possibly it's a firmware thing, I don't know, but it's supposed to be telling me the correct time, was actually still showing the old time before the clocks went back. And I left it for, actually until I came out here, so for over 10 days, to see if it would eventually synchronize. And it didn't. I had to actually take the battery out, put it back in, reset it, and allow it to resynchronize, and then it started showing the correct time. But without, without manual intervention, that clock would have carried on showing the wrong time. And again, from one of these reports, there are real-world failures that have occurred due to not keeping your time synchronized. So in 2019, in New York, they failed to update some critical systems. And so when there was a rollover on April the 6th, they didn't roll over and a bunch of things failed. So important stuff like traffic lights. So I can imagine the chaos in New York. I'm glad I wasn't there on April 6, 2019. And that lasted for nearly 2 weeks before they sorted it out. Same event actually grounded a load of Dreamliners in China because they hadn't updated their clocks or they hadn't updated their synchronization systems. And indeed, some of them were showing a 20-year difference in between correct time and not correct time. So. And again, just beginning of the month in a different London, the one in Ontario, the telco pushed out a clock rollback a week early. So you had people posting on social media images like this, where they've got two phones next to each other showing an hour different time. Which kind of doesn't sound like a big deal, but there was a knock-on. So far, I've only managed to find any consumer-related effects. So, some passengers missed their flights because they showed up an hour too late. But remember, when we looked at the NTP, PTP diagrams, some of the Stratum 0 clocks do actually potentially connect to and Stratum 1 clocks connect to the local telco. So in that case, if there is a Stratum 0 or Stratum 1 clock in Ontario that took that signal as gospel and then started pushing it out, then who knows what other systems were affected. As I say, I haven't actually seen any in the news, but it's possible they will come out later. It was only 10 days ago, so. And then one of the funniest, I guess, or most interesting was a delivery driver in Newark who wanted to hide his actual presence from his bosses. So he bought a cheap jammer so that they couldn't see him on the map when he went off somewhere quiet to have a nap instead of doing his deliveries. Unfortunately for him, he was very near to the airport. So his jamming device didn't just jam their ability to track him, it actually grounded flights and caused major problems. So that report kind of got me thinking, well, how hard is it to do? If you can buy a cheap GPS jammer, can you go further than that and actually spoof GPS and create a different time signal rather than just blocking the time signal? So again, did a bit of hunting around, and sure enough, there's an SDR simulation package that will simulate satellites for you. And one of the things you can do is you can override the time parameters which are transmitted in the plane and just set whatever time you want. And it will then create a scenario of multiple satellites that appear to be visible to your local receiver, and your receiver will see the time that you have set rather than the real time. DVB, I know from experience that is actually pretty easy. I did a talk a few years ago called Black Button Pivot, which was talking about man in the middling the UK TV broadcast. So I was receiving a complete transponder signal, stripping out all the data and reinserting my own version of it. In that case, I was doing it to take over the code execution on the TV itself, because we, in the UK, we have a standard called MHEG, which includes some programmatical network-capable stuff. But also, within normal digital TV broadcast, there is this thing called the time and date table, which, again, in plain text, carries the current UTC time. So part of what I had to do to get my signal to work was to re-inject that time once I'd stripped out the digital PATs and PIDs from the signal. I had to re-inject the PDT in order to get the TV to have accurate timing in order to play the stream. So I know from experience that's easily doable, and there's an off-the-shelf package, OpenCaster, which has all the necessary tools to do it. And then finally, TX Tempus, which is the tool I'm using for these, with any luck, hasn't done it. The curse of the demo. Let me try. I'll tell you what, I'm going to reset this guy, because overriding versus starting from scratch is two different things. Of course, it worked every time in every test I've done, but I didn't sacrifice enough unicorns before the talk. So yeah, basically, this is going to take a while, by the way. The signal is a very, very basic low-frequency signal. It's like every minute you just send out a amplitude-modulated beeps and boops that the clock receives. There's no handshake, there's no crypto, there's no authentication. It's just broadcast. And if the clock receives it, then you're away. So let me just check my script is running. Yep, should be. Okay, we've got a few minutes left, so I will go to conclusions, and we can have questions if there are any, and hopefully that will kick in while we're doing our questions. So yeah, my conclusions are basically accurate time is obviously very important to all of us, not just governments and banks, but we rely on it. We take it so for granted we don't even kind of think about it. Needs to be distributed some very easily accessible method, cheap and essentially free for all. I mean, you obviously have to buy your equipment, but we shouldn't be reverting to the old subscription methods that we used to do back in the 1800s, where you would either pay someone who had a very accurate pocket watch to set his time from Greenwich Mean Time and then walk around to your premises and you would take a reading from his watch, through to the synchronized signals that came from the master clocks. Single sources are bad. Well, who knew? GPS as a single source of failure is obviously a serious problem. And as I say, that's something that government and industry are taking very seriously now, and they're trying to create a secondary resilient platform to provide land-based secure time. But it isn't there yet, and it's only really been being pushed for the last couple of years. So, as I said at the beginning, I find that surprising. We've been relying on this technology for decades, and yet we've only just thought about, well, what if satellites fail? So that's kind of interesting, and I think it's it's useful for people like us to think about alternative solutions and not leave it to governments and organizations that have created that problem in the first place. So. And obviously attackers and their tools are becoming increasingly sophisticated. If you can spoof a signal and take out a whole city's GPS clocks just with one powerful transmitter or a few cheap powerful transmitters, that's clearly a big problem. And as I say, it seems to be currently someone else's problem. We just take it for granted, assume someone's dealing with it. So, questions. If anyone has a question, there's microphones at the back.
Hi, Adam.
Hi.
Federico from Turn Micro. Long time no see.
Yeah, how are you?
Thank you very much. It's a very fascinating talk.
Thank you.
As you know, time is also essential for cryptography and in particular for certifications. So I was wondering first of all, if you have any knowledge of past incidents that somehow have impacted certification authorities or PKIs. And if not, what's the outlook given that digital certification is increasingly playing an essential role in everyday lives? Because the incidents that you have shown, yes, did have an impact on real life because they have impacted the physical systems that we interact with or depend to, right?
Yeah.
But here we're talking about a purely software system that we're going to depend from in the next years.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the only incidents that I'm really aware of to do with time and PKI is to do with things running out. So, expiring certificates, things not being reacted to early enough. It would be interesting, but again, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, that if people aren't focusing on time as an attack vector, there may be a lot of stuff sliding under the radar that we're not aware of, that people just aren't looking for. So, one of the first things I looked at was time in forensic investigations. And, could someone be deliberately skewing clocks in order to cloak what they're doing? And I suspect it will turn out that people have been doing interesting things with local clocking in order to circumvent PKI in some way, but I'm not aware of any specific incidents. Be interesting to find out, though. Any other questions? Did my demo work? Yes. Thank you. So sorry about the inside joke. This is for Space Rogue. So thank you for coming, and thank you for your time. And I'll be here for a little while. I've actually got to shoot off early this afternoon, so I'm not going to be around all day. But if you want to come and chat, give me a shout. Thank you.